everybody. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
So now we're on episode 5 of True Words, the Shingon Buddhist podcast. And what was the topic today?
Well, we got a request online to talk a little about the Kechien Kanjo, the service or ritual that's done on Koya-san for finding one's connection with the particular Buddha or Bodhisattva.
Oh, okay. So what is this actually? How does it work?
Well, the Kechien Kanjo is a ritual that was started, I guess, historically, can be traced back to Kobo Daishi's time. I think the first written record shows up around the year 812. And it was a way of providing an esoteric initiation for anyone. So it was done in the palace. The various emperors were given this service. Other people would come and take part in the service. And it's a way of finding or making a connection with one of the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas that's depicted in the mandala. So there's actually two versions, one given in the spring on Koya-san and another given in the fall, where one of the two mandalas is used for that ritual, either the womb world mandala or the diamond world mandala. So that's kind of the very basics, I guess.
So is there any, how do they decide which mandala goes with which season? Is there any significance to that?
I'm not sure that there's a specific significance on the season. They break it up. When it's done on Koya-san, there's thousands of people who come for the ceremony. So there's I think the practical aspect of ordering the few days. It's usually for 2 to 3 days straight when it's done, October and May. And it takes a lot of people to set up, to conduct the service, and then all the people that just make everything run in terms of orientation, getting people where they need to be, things along those lines. So they usually break it up into for the seasons.
Okay, gotcha. So you mentioned that it took a few days. So what does it look like for a participant?
Well, so I had the opportunity 2 years ago was the 1200 year anniversary of the founding of Koya-san. So the temples in Hawaii took a group of people to Koya-san. So we had about 70 people, roughly about 2 tour buses filled. And we took the group to Koya-san. And part of that experience was the members going through the Kechien Kanjo service. So every Shingon priest goes through a more elaborate version when they're ordained, but in that respect, you're a participant. So this time I got to actually see sort of the behind the scenes and how it was operated and explain it to people and help them go through it. So the first step is kind of what you'd expect, an orientation of this is what you're about to do, and telling people just kind of the basic overview. So the very first step of the service is everyone assembles and is led into a large room. And this is at the Daishi Kukai complex. So it's a very large, yet newer temple complex on Koya-san. And inside one of the main halls, they're transmitted the 10 precepts. So in every major Shingon service, the 10 precepts are recited, and that's the first step of the service. So I thought maybe we've been talking a little bit about Buddhist practices. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the 10 precepts and then talk about their place in the Kechien Kanjo.
Okay. So these 10 are, they're essentially the 5 precepts, right? Plus a few more.
That's correct. So if you look on, for example, I get this question often on email. What books should someone study, or what kind of things should people study when they're interested in Shingon? And most people look at the Wikipedia article and they'll see the major sutras that are the philosophical foundation for the Shingon school. So if you look at the Wikipedia entry for Shingon, it lists the Mahavajracana Sutra, the Dainichi Kyo, the Vajrasakkara Sutra, the Kongo Cho Kyo, and the Prajnaparamita Naya Sutra, the Rishikyo, and some others. So while that is probably true from overall philosophical foundation, more helpful to read would probably be most of the major sutras of Mahayana Buddhism, and to sort of understand the connection that those sutras have to daily practice. So part of what you see in the 10 precepts really are probably the 10 paramitas or 10 perfections, are guidelines, instructions to the individual on how to practice. So oftentimes in English, they're presented in a very basic form without explanation, kind of a thou shalt not, or try to avoid these things. So they tend to get glossed over, or people say, okay, I'm not going to kill, I'm not going to steal, I'm not going to lie. But actually they can be turned around into what you should do. So how should you practice? How should you live? And those instructions are kind of the spirit behind what's transmitted in the Kechien Kanjo. So I thought maybe we could start off with those, and then maybe the service itself, and then the regular Shingon service that's recited would make more sense to people.
Gotcha. Okay. So just to clarify, these 10 precepts are separate from the 10 Sramanera precepts or the 10 novice monk precepts, right?
That's correct. They're not given in the same with the same expectation of upholding, more along the lines of guidelines for living.
Yeah. Okay. So looking over these, with the 10 precepts, it seems like they have a theme going on. So it's directed towards body, speech, and mind, the 3 karmas or the 3 mysteries.
That's correct. Yes. So you're looking at how do you create karma, both in a way that maybe we would determine as positive, and then ways to avoid getting into trouble, or ways to avoid conduct that would result in results that we would find unfavorable.
Okay.
But so those are the kind of 10 precepts. But in terms of practice, you can look at them as the 10 perfections, 10 paramitas, depending. And that perspective really, instead of not stealing, you look at, well, what's the opposite of what you should do? And the opposite would be sharing or generosity. So I think if they're stated that way, it kind of gives a better focus on how should we practice. So if we're on the theme of Shingon practice, that may make a little bit more sense of what people should do versus what they should avoid.
Yeah, and especially with my work in psychology, I also learn about this too, how if you tell someone to not do something, sometimes it backfires and it will lead to more of that activity. Whereas when we give people a more descriptive task and tell them to do something, that's more likely to be followed. So all of the signs that say do not pick flowers from this garden, studies have shown that people are more likely to pick those flowers.
I think that's true. I was discussing this list with someone probably a year or so ago, and they felt like the teaching was sort of looking down on them, or assuming that they would make these kind of juvenile mistakes, or almost as if the teaching was childish. I remember when I was in school, there were posters in the room that said, citizenship and sharing, and had a picture of someone giving something to somebody else. That's what it made them think of. So I think, at least from a Western perspective, it may be helpful to look at sort of the positive side of it, or what you should do, um, rather than what should be avoided. And that's probably culturally maybe a little bit better perspective for teaching.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So,
Mhm.
can we actually backtrack a little bit? So,
Sure.
why do people participate in Kechien Kanjo? What is generally the motivation behind this? What should the purpose be?
Well, I think early on in Shingon's travel to Japan, the introduction from China to Japan, it was viewed as something that first required a lot of scholarship, maybe even multiple language skills, and was a very daunting um, practice to try to take on. And Kobo Daishi tried to make it very accessible to people. And a big part of Shingon practice is experience. So there's a lot of experiential practices rather than what it may look like from the outside of scholarly practices. For example, the Shikoku pilgrimage is very experiential. It's something you undergo and you take part in for weeks and months. And the Kechien Kanjo was something where you could be immersed in and surrounded by the teaching without having to do a great deal of scholarly work. There's no reading or translation required. The point of the ritual is to give you an experience. And in that experience, you get a taste of what the higher ordination is like. You get a taste of what a lot of the rituals are like within Shingon, but you're taking part in it rather than being a passive participant or just watching. You actually participate in the service.
So, having been through both, sort of the one for lay people and then the one for actual ordination, how different are they? Are they very similar?
They are very similar. Of course, the one when you're ordained is vastly longer. So the one that's given publicly lasts about 45 minutes to an hour. And then for ordination, it's 12 to 14 hours probably. It's a much longer version. Um, that said, it's long partially because you are undergoing it as a group. Your individual participation is, if it was only one person, it would be shorter, but you go through it as a group. So I think part of the beauty of the service is you have this experience that you share with a small group of people, and when you come out, you've all experienced it together, and you have a new shared memory. And I think just watching people watch the way they talked about it, their reaction to it, and their shared reaction was something that became very special to them, and it really becomes transformative. So I talked a little bit, I think, in one of the previous podcasts about just kind of the silent sitting meditation for spiritual practice not being the only thing people should do. That there's a lot of practices within Buddhism. Kechien Kanjo is one of those practices where the practice is imposed on you. It's given to you. You're sort of ushered along, and you experience it almost like maybe a roller coaster ride. So you don't have to know all the details. It's something to you allow it to happen, and the experience of it is often very transformative in that respect.
Okay. So, going back to what we were talking about earlier with the 10 precepts, back on track now.
Mm-hmm.
So they take in this ceremony, they take the 10 precepts, and how does it go from there?
So normally you enter a room, and this is very common on Koya and many Shingon temples. There's no electric light. So when we took the group 2 years ago, you enter the main hall, you take a seat, everybody's sitting very close together, and the room is very, very dark. So there's only candlelight. So it takes a good 5 minutes for your eyes to fully adjust from, midday, full bright sunlight to this very darkened room with maybe just a few candles. And then the officiant would enter and then ask you to bow your head, and they begin the initiation at that point. And you're instructed to repeat after them to take the 10 precepts. So to not kill, steal, commit adultery, the entire list. So you repeat those 10 precepts, and then you're given a specific Buddhist teaching. And that is probably different each time, but that is, in our case, because most of our participants were from the United States, something that was translated. So we did have people there that would translate it for our participants. So normally the Kechien Kanjo is given on Koya-san. To my knowledge, it was given one time in the United States, and that was in the year 2000 in Honolulu, Hawaii, on the anniversary, the 100-year anniversary celebration for the founding of the Hawaii Shingon Mission. So it had been, I think at that point, 100 years since the first temple had opened in Hawaii. So they gave the Kechien Kanjo there, either at the Art Museum or Convention Center. I can't recall right now, but it was a pretty big event in the state, and a lot of people were able to take part in it.
Okay. So also I was wondering, what's the difference between the two versions? Because you mentioned there's one in the fall and one in the spring.
Yeah, so the one in the spring and fall, they break it up with depending on which mandala the person is entering into. So you're actually finding a connection with one of the two mandalas that are used in Shingon. So in the actual Kechien Kanjo ritual, the mandala is spread flat on the altar, and after taking the 10 precepts, the person is then led into a second hall where the mandalas are laid flat. They're blindfolded and given a flower. The flower is placed between their fingers, and then they're led to the altar, and when the time comes, they drop the flower on the altar. So this scene is also seen in movie Kukai. So back in the early 80s, a movie was made, major motion picture, on the life of Kobo Daishi, the founder of Shingon Buddhism. And that scene is recreated in the movie. So you would drop the flower on the altar, then the blindfold is removed and you see where the flower dropped. You would then leave the main hall and be given instructions regarding that specific Buddha. So what is the mantra of that Buddha or Bodhisattva, and then a little bit of information about it. So the person could then go home and practice that mantra as part of their spiritual practice, as part of their meditation.
Okay. So with the two mandalas, what is the difference for the person who is participating?
So you're looking at one mandala kind of representing, in a very, very basic sense, representing the spiritual practice in our current world. How do you actually approach enlightenment? How do you practice in this world? And the second mandala, what is it? What is the world of enlightenment like? Once you are enlightened, what is that world like? So the presentation of the two mandalas is quite different graphically, and a lot of times you'll see the same Buddhas represented, but they may have different mudras or postures. So their representation or presentation is going to be somewhat different depending on what they're teaching. So each mandala has a slightly different perspective or slightly different aspect to teach. And of course, although I started this saying probably those major sutras that underlies Shingon are not necessarily the first thing to read if you're interested. But once you get into them, you'll start to see this underlying teaching of non-duality, of not seeing a difference between the two, but from our understanding how they differ based on where we are currently in our own spiritual practice.
Okay. So what else goes on during the initiation?
So I'll start off by saying that the Kechien Kanjo, when I did it, was for ordination. And I was surprised by just the sheer number of people involved in the service. When you go into the hall, there's a series of folding screens set up. So you only see a small portion at a time. So you don't realize necessarily step by step. You can't look across the hall and say, oh, I'm going to end up over there. So there's a little bit of, I guess, a feeling of disorientation. So you go from bright sunlight to a dark room. You're ushered into a next hall. And there's a lot of turns based on the way the screens are set up. And I think it's really engineered to how, and it's very low tech, right? This is very, very low tech. How do you get people out of their day-to-day thinking, kind of literally lead people from being very busy with their smartphones and text messages and, whatever they were preoccupied with, into a different, literally a different world. You're entering the temple in a very different perspective. So you are led through these different rooms set up with folded screens, and at each stage given specific instruction. So in case someone listening does go through the Kechien Kanjo, I'm going to leave some details out, not because they're secret or it's hidden, just so as not to spoil your experience. The Kechien Kanjo really is about your experience. It really is. It does have some surprising elements, or at times when you don't know necessarily what's coming next. And I think that lends a certain beauty to the experience, rather than maybe what we're used to in the West, of having very detailed explanations and reviews and commentary on maybe every little piece and aspect, and then making up our mind or formulating an idea in advance of actually having the experience. So to some degree, try to enter the experience fresh. So they will lead you into the main hall, and then one by one, the participants are taken blindfolded into another room where they given the flower and they drop the flower on the altar. Once the flower's dropped, the blindfold is removed, and then you see before you the mandala laid out on the altar. Everyone who's led you there, and you see which Buddha or Bodhisattva you made the connection with specifically. Then you're taken to another hall where the instruction is given based on how the flower fell. And so there's a couple other steps in that process, which I think have been very special to participants. But in general, you sit one-on-one with one of the acharyas and receive that instruction and receive the mandala, receive the mantra directly. And there are a few, I guess, mementos you'd receive at the end you can take home, including a little description of the service and certification that you've gone through it. And then you'd exit the temple at that point. So in my experience, leading people through it, sort of watching the surprise, watching going from a kind of a darkened room into a hall completely candle lit, very dark, and having that blindfold removed to see the mandala. There's a lot of symbolism in the ritual. One of going from our kind of mundane day-to-day life, going into the darkness. You can think of it as almost like being reborn. You emerge from the darkness, and you have something revealed to you. So we could probably go on and on with all the art motifs and symbolism there. But the experience of it, I think, has been, obviously since 812, something that people come back to, that people seek out as a part of their spiritual practice. Hopefully, if we, I think, get enough people interested, perhaps the Kechien Kanjo can be offered again in North America. We're coming up on almost 20 years since the last time, so hopefully it's something that can be done again in the future.
Okay. But until then, if anybody wants to participate, they'll have to go to Koya-san headquarters?
That's correct. Currently, just by sheer number of people required. So just to give I can hear our listeners groaning that maybe going to Japan is a little bit daunting. There's currently only, I'm going to do a rough count, perhaps 15 to 20 Shingon teachers in the United States. The majority are in Hawaii. And it would probably take every single person to do this service. I believe when it was done in Hawaii in 2000, there was a large number of people who came over from Japan to help, both for setup, to lead the people in. For example, on Koya-san, people are brought in groups of 20 to 40. So just orienting everyone, getting the blindfolds and flowers ready, instructing every person on what they're going to do, the follow-up instruction. It does take a lot of staffing. So currently there's hardly enough people in the country to do it at this time. But it is offered on Koya-san every year.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the work involved with this isn't something that, say, lay volunteers can help with. For example, there might be the manpower in lay volunteers, but then they don't have the knowledge required to help set up for this or to help administer these sorts of events.
That's correct. I mean, obviously the kind of basic setup of arranging things could be done with volunteers, but the actual giving of the precepts, leading the prayers, there's a lot of mantra practice that's involved, guiding the people in the mantras, instructing them with a specific teaching afterwards is usually done by the acharyas, the ajari directly. So that is a hurdle currently. There's just in North America, I think we're at maybe 6 people. Right? There just aren't enough. I mean, Los Angeles, Sacramento, Portland, Seattle and Portland each are have one minister. So there's definitely a shortage of people available to teach.
So we have to figure out that first, before we get anything like this of this scale in the U.S. So it might be a few years.
It may be a few years, but I think there's interest. But it would have to be a few years in the planning, and then of course to make it worthwhile, give people enough notice as to when it's going to be, to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate. So I'd hate to have it done and people find out afterwards, regret not being able to attend.
Yeah. So is there anything else that we're missing for the ceremony?
I think that's a pretty good overview of the ceremony. I mean, I've probably gone over 80%. Like I said, I'll leave out a few details just so that if you go through it, there's a element of surprise or it still feels fresh. But I guess from a historical perspective, this was very different in Japan when Kobo Daishi brought this practice over. From my understanding, historically, the original mandalas he brought back from China were actually worn out with these types of services. So they had to be repainted and they had to create new ones, but they got a lot of use in this type of service in the palace and around the country. of people wanting to go through this. How did they find their connection? What mantra, what Buddha should they practice? Wanting to feel as if they've gone through a very transformative process. And that was something that really helped to cement their practice. And I think, especially in North America, that's something all of us struggle with. How do we start a practice? How do we stick with it? How do we keep going? And that energy is really important. And of course, one of the 10 paramitas is going to be this vigor, this effort to, energy to keep our practice going, and is a very important part. So, an experience like this can be very helpful, but it doesn't have to be specifically the Kechien Kanjo. It can be, putting the effort in to go visit one of the existing temples, making a pilgrimage. I have a friend that just recently finished the Shikoku pilgrimage, by foot, walking, and, they can't stop talking. The experience was, intellectually they knew what they were going to do, but the experience of it, meeting all the people along the way, was something just totally life transforming. So, but again, it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be 2 to 3 months out of your life. It could be, visiting a Dharma center near you, visiting a temple, take some time to do a practice. But the Kechien Kanjo in general has that energy behind it. There's very few opportunities that we have to engage in something like that. And, the great benefit of course, if you do have a chance to go to Japan and experience it, is being in the environment of Koya-san, being in the temples, and it's almost like walking back in time. So in that way, I think it's quite beautiful.
Okay. So before we wrap up, we kind of touched a little bit about this, but we didn't make it very explicit. What does Kechien Kanjo mean, literally?
So it literally, I guess probably a good translation in English would be kind of finding your connection. So how do you find your connection, or making a connection with the Buddha? So especially when Kobo Daishi brought the service back, Buddhism was something that was primarily the practice of people at court or in the imperial palace. It wasn't a religion of the people in the way that we would think of religion today, where you'd see a church or temple on every corner. So this was a practice where people felt like now it's out of the monastery, and it's something that I can actually do, that I can actually take part with. So Kechien is a connection with the Buddha, and with the teaching specifically. So I think in that respect, it's as a human being, we all need something to hold on to. We all need an experience, something to look back on, and from that we create the fuel to keep moving forward. So in that way, it can be a very beautiful experience.
Okay. All right. Anything else to add?
Well, I think our podcast is always new. So as we talk about these topics, I keep getting new ideas. So, and I welcome our listeners to suggest other topics. So this was a request on the YouTube channel. So hopefully people have other things that are on their mind, and we can address those in future episodes.
Oh yeah, definitely. We can always add to our growing list of future topics. So we'll get to them.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Sensei, and see you all next week.
Thank you again. It's always good to talk to you.